You're a man with no future." Those were the exact words Olivia Hayes said to me while she stood by the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone like I was just background noise in a life she had already stopped respecting. I remember the sound of the faucet dripping in the sink more clearly than my own response, because I didn't respond at all. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my life I thought silence meant strength. But that night, I realized silence is just what people use when they no longer expect you to matter. Olivia didn't yell. She didn't need to. She just said it the way someone comments on the weather in Manhattan, casual, final, like the conclusion had already been approved somewhere I wasn't invited to. We lived in a high-rise apartment overlooking downtown Manhattan, the kind of place where the lights never really turn off and the city always feels like it's judging you through the glass. On paper, we were supposed to be a success story. Olivia was a rising executive at Hayes Global Technologies, always dressed in tailored suits that looked like they belonged in boardrooms instead of closets. People admired her confidence, her clarity, the way she could end conversations with a smile that didn't leave room for argument. And me, I was just Ethan, the husband who worked remotely, who handled things at home, who made life easier so she could focus on her career. At least, that's how she introduced me at company dinners. It started small, the way disrespect usually does. A correction in tone when I spoke, a pause before answering my questions, the subtle shift from partnership to permission. I noticed it first during dinner one night when I mentioned a project I had been advising on, and she laughed softly like I had told a joke that wasn't funny, but also not worth correcting in public. "You don't really understand how that world works anymore," she said afterward, wiping her mouth with a napkin, not even looking up. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself people go through phases, that stress changes tone, that ambition sometimes creates distance, but not damage. But distance has a way of becoming identity when you stop challenging it. Over the next months, I became a presence in my own home rather than a participant. Olivia would leave early, return late, her schedule filling every space where conversation used to live. Our apartment became quieter, not because nothing was said, but because nothing was asked. Even my name started to sound different when she said it, like it belonged to someone she used to know in a previous chapter of her life. The moment everything shifted wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday morning. She stood near the mirror adjusting her earrings, speaking more to her reflection than to me. "Honestly, Ethan, I don't see where this is going for you," she said, as if she were reviewing a failed investment instead of a marriage. I remember nodding, not because I agreed, but because it felt easier than explaining something I couldn't prove. That day I walked through Midtown, past glass buildings filled with people who looked like they all had destinations. I stopped in front of Hayes Global Technologies headquarters, a tower of steel and reflection that seemed to bend light around itself like it owned even the sky above it. I had been inside that building before, dozens of times, always through side entrances, always as Olivia's husband, always acknowledged just enough to be forgotten immediately after. But that day, standing outside, something felt different, like a door I didn't know existed had quietly unlocked somewhere behind me. I didn't know then what was coming. I only knew that the version of me Olivia had dismissed didn't feel like it fit anymore, not because she was right, but because something underneath her words had already started moving without permission. The next morning did not feel like a turning point at first. It felt like any other morning in Manhattan, the kind where sunlight reflects off glass towers in a way that makes everything look cleaner than it really is. I woke up before Olivia, as I usually did, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold while I stared out at the city below. Somewhere down there, thousands of people were already moving with purpose, and for a moment I wondered when I had stopped feeling like one of them. Olivia walked in at 7:45, already dressed in a charcoal gray suit, hair perfectly controlled, phone in her hand. She barely looked up as she took her coffee. "I have back-to-back meetings today," she said, scrolling. "Do not wait up for dinner." It was not a request, it was a statement of scheduling. I nodded, the same way I always did, and watched her leave like she was stepping out of a life I was no longer included in. After the door closed, the apartment felt larger, not because anything had changed physically, but because something had quietly been removed from it. I sat at the table, finished my coffee, and opened my laptop. There were emails waiting, some from consulting contacts I had not engaged with in months, others from numbers I did not immediately recognize. One subject line stood out. Urgent confirmation required for executive transition protocol. I stared at it for a few seconds longer than I should have. It was not unusual for me to receive corporate correspondence in some capacity, but this one felt different, formal in a way that carried weight rather than routine. I clicked it open. The message was short, direct, and impersonal, stating that effective immediately, a leadership transition process within Hayes Global Technologies was being initiated, and that certain legacy authority structures would be consolidated under a single executive appointment pending final board confirmation. There was no mention of names, only references to codes, agreements, and a trust structure I had only ever seen once before in a document I signed years ago, without fully understanding its long-term implications. I closed the laptop slowly. The apartment was still quiet, but now the silence felt organized, like something had been arranged in it without my knowledge. I stood up and walked to the window. From that height, the city looked stable, predictable, but I knew better than to trust appearances in a place built on hidden movement. My phone buzzed. An unknown number. I answered without speaking. A man's voice came through, calm and professional, addressing me by name as if it had always belonged in formal contexts. He stated that there had been activation of a dormant executive clause tied to previous corporate restructuring agreements, and that my presence was required at Hayes Global Technologies headquarters within the hour for verification and acknowledgement procedures. I asked him to repeat it, not because I did not hear him, but because my mind was trying to place the words in a reality that made sense. He repeated it exactly the same way, with the same controlled tone, as if this was something that happened every day. When the call ended, I remained standing there for a long time, looking out at the city without actually seeing it. I thought about Olivia leaving that morning, her words from the night before, the way she had dismissed me so easily, and for the first time I realized something simple but unsettling. She had not been wrong about me having no future. She had only been wrong about whose future it was. I set the phone down on the counter and looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I did not look different, but something about the way I was looking back felt unfamiliar, like a version of me that had been waiting quietly behind everything I had accepted for too long. The clock on the wall ticked forward, steady and indifferent, as I picked up my jacket and walked toward the door. By the time I stepped out of the apartment, the city had already shifted into its daytime rhythm, horns echoing between buildings, footsteps rushing across sidewalks, and the constant low vibration of a place that never truly pauses. I stood at the curb for a moment, not because I was uncertain about where I was going, but because I was aware that once I moved forward, I would not be able to pretend ignorance anymore. A black car was already waiting, positioned half a block down as if it had been there long before I decided to leave. The driver did not speak when I approached. He simply opened the door, and I got in. The interior smelled clean, expensive, and unfamiliar, like something designed for people who made decisions that affected more than just their own lives. The ride through Manhattan was silent except for the faint hum of tires against pavement. I watched the city pass by, thinking about Olivia in a conference room somewhere, explaining strategies, leading conversations, never once imagining that anything about her day could be interrupted by me. When we arrived at Hayes Global Technologies headquarters, the building looked different than it had the day before. Not physically different, but conceptually heavier, like it now contained something I had previously been excluded from. The lobby was wide, polished, and filled with people who moved with controlled urgency. As I stepped inside, conversation softened, eyes shifted, and I noticed something I had not seen before. Recognition without explanation. A woman at the front desk looked at me, hesitated, then stood immediately. "Mr. Walker," she said, as if the name carried instructions. I did not correct her. Instead, I continued forward, guided by a man who appeared without introduction and led me toward a private elevator. The ascent was smooth, too smooth, the kind of movement that removes any sense of distance. Floor numbers climbed quietly, until the doors opened onto a level I had never been shown. The hallway was quieter here, the lighting softer, and at the end of it was a set of glass doors that reflected my image back at me in fragments. Before I could reach them, the doors opened from the inside. A man in a tailored suit greeted me with a respectful nod, not introducing himself, only stepping aside as if my arrival had already been accounted for in advance planning. "They are waiting for you," he said. I walked into the room. It was a boardroom, long and structured, surrounded by glass and skyline views that made the city look distant and manageable. Around the table sat individuals I recognized from financial publications and corporate events Olivia had once mentioned in passing. None of them spoke immediately. Instead, there was a brief moment of observation, like they were confirming alignment between expectation and reality. At the far end of the table, a folder was placed directly in front of the empty central seat. The chair itself remained unoccupied, as if waiting for someone who had not yet officially arrived. I was guided toward it without instruction. As I sat down, the atmosphere shifted subtly, not dramatically, but enough to signal that something procedural had been completed. A man on my right opened the folder. Inside were documents, signatures, and structured references to governance rights, equity allocations, and executive authority transitions tied to Hayes Global Technologies. He slid one page forward and pointed to a line requiring confirmation. My name was already printed at the top. I looked at it for a long moment without speaking. The room did not rush me. No one interrupted. Somewhere in the silence, I understood that this was not an invitation being extended. It was an acknowledgement being finalized. And then I heard footsteps outside the glass doors. I did not turn immediately, but I already knew. When I finally looked up, Olivia was standing there, still in her morning attire, her expression composed in the way she always maintained in professional spaces. But this room was not one she had entered expecting to find me in. For the first time in a long time, she did not speak immediately. And in that silence, I realized the distance between what she believed my life was and what it had quietly become had just collapsed into a single moment of recognition. The moment Olivia appeared behind the glass doors, the entire atmosphere inside the boardroom shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, like a subtle change in pressure before a storm fully forms. She stood still, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the door frame, eyes scanning the room as if trying to reassemble reality from fragments that no longer aligned. I watched her carefully, not because I wanted to, but because I could see the exact second she realized that this was not a coincidence. Her composure, the same one she always carried into negotiations and executive meetings, remained intact for a few seconds longer than necessary, but I noticed the slight tightening at the corner of her jaw, the smallest hesitation in her breathing, the kind that only appears when control begins to slip. No one in the room spoke. Even the executives around the table, men and women who regularly moved billions of dollars in decisions, remained silent, as if waiting for something formal to occur before acknowledging what was already happening. The man beside me placed a document in front of me and adjusted his tone. "We can proceed with verbal confirmation," he said. "Your authority under the Walker succession framework is now active pending final acknowledgement." The words were precise, but they no longer felt abstract. They felt grounded in the way everyone in the room reacted to them. Olivia finally stepped inside. The doors closed behind her without sound. She looked at me first, not at the documents, not at the executives, but directly at me, as if trying to locate the version of me she had dismissed only days before. There was no anger in her expression, only confusion layered beneath disbelief, as though her understanding of how the world worked had been interrupted without warning. "Ethan," she said finally, but her voice carried less certainty than before, like she was testing whether my name still functioned the same way in this environment. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I looked down at the document in front of me, then back at the room, then finally at her. The silence stretched long enough for everyone to become aware that something irreversible had already taken place. A senior board member cleared his throat softly and stood, addressing the room in a measured tone. He explained that the executive transition protocol had been initiated in accordance with long-standing governance structures tied to legacy ownership rights, structures that had remained dormant until activation conditions were met. He did not elaborate further, but the implication was clear enough that no one needed additional explanation. Olivia listened, her eyes shifting between him and me, her posture still controlled but no longer anchored in certainty. I could see her recalculating, not just the situation, but her memory of every interaction that had led here. Every dismissal, every assumption, every moment she had categorized me as something static and insignificant. The man beside me slid the final page toward me. It required a verbal acknowledgement. I placed my hand on the edge of the table, not rushing, not hesitating, and confirmed my acceptance. The room responded not with applause or celebration, but with a collective stillness, the kind that appears when hierarchy reorganizes itself in real time. Olivia took a step forward, stopping just short of the table. "This is not possible," she said, but her voice lacked conviction now, as if she was no longer arguing with me, but with the structure around me. I finally spoke, my voice steady, without emphasis. "It was always possible," I said. "You just were never included in the part where it mattered." The words were not dramatic, but they landed with enough weight to change the temperature of the room. One of the executives looked down at the documents again, as if confirming something they already knew but had not fully processed. Olivia remained standing, her eyes fixed on me, searching for something familiar to anchor herself to, but the version of me she was looking for was no longer the one sitting in front of her. I closed the folder slowly and leaned back slightly in my chair. Outside the glass, Manhattan continued its movement, unchanged and indifferent, but inside the room, every assumption had quietly collapsed into a new structure that no longer required permission to exist. For several seconds after I finished speaking, the boardroom did not move. It was not silence caused by shock alone, but something more structured, like everyone present was recalibrating their understanding of what authority meant in a space that had just changed its center of gravity. Olivia was still standing near the entrance, her eyes locked on me, but the confidence she normally carried into every environment no longer aligned with what she was seeing. I could tell she was trying to find a version of this moment that made sense within her existing assumptions, but none of them fit anymore. The man seated to my right gently closed the folder in front of me, then placed both hands on the table as he began to speak again, his tone calm and procedural. He explained that what had just been activated was not a new decision, but the execution of a pre-existing governance. Structure tied to legacy equity control, structured years in advance as part of a succession contingency designed to prevent external fragmentation of the company. His words were careful, but they carried an unavoidable weight, because they confirmed that nothing happening now was improvised. Olivia finally moved forward, slowly, her heels making soft contact with the polished floor. She stopped just short of the table, her eyes shifting between the executives and the documents in front of me. "There must be some mistake," she said, but the phrasing lacked the certainty she usually used when issuing corrections. No one responded immediately. Instead, the same executive who had spoken earlier opened a secondary document and turned it slightly so she could see it from where she stood. I watched her expression change as she scanned the contents. It was subtle at first, a tightening around her eyes, a brief pause in her breathing, but then something deeper shifted, something that could not be controlled through professional composure. She looked at me again, this time differently, not as someone she was trying to understand in real time, but as someone she was trying to reclassify from memory. "You never said anything about this," she said quietly. The words were not accusatory at first, but they carried the beginning of realization. I remained seated, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. "You never asked," I replied, not with force, but with clarity. The room absorbed the exchange without interruption. One of the senior board members adjusted his posture and spoke again, explaining that all executive authority transitions had been reviewed multiple times by legal and fiduciary committees over the years, and that the activation condition was triggered automatically upon verification of specific criteria that had just been met. Olivia turned slightly toward him, then back to me, as if trying to locate a gap in the explanation that would restore the version of reality she had been operating under. But there was none. The structure was complete, and it was already in motion. I stood up slowly for the first time since entering the room. The movement was not dramatic, but it shifted attention in a way that silence could not. I walked a few steps toward the glass wall overlooking the city. Manhattan stretched out below, uninterrupted, indifferent, continuing its rhythm without awareness of the change happening above it. Behind me, I could hear papers being adjusted, chairs shifting slightly, the subtle sounds of professionals adjusting to a new hierarchy that had not been announced, but simply revealed. Olivia spoke again, but her voice was softer now. "Ethan, what does this mean for us?" she asked. The question hung in the air longer than anything else had that day. I did not turn around immediately. When I finally did, I looked at her the way one looks at a decision that has already been made but not yet acknowledged by everyone involved. It means, I said calmly, you were right about one thing. There was no future in the version of me you chose to see. I paused, allowing the words to settle before continuing. The only difference is, that version was never the full story. The room remained still, not because anyone was unsure of what had been said, but because everyone understood that nothing further needed to be added. Olivia stood motionless, her expression no longer defensive, but unsettled in a way that had nothing to do with argument and everything to do with recognition. The city outside continued to move, unchanged, but inside the room, every assumption that had once defined relationships, status, and identity had already been reorganized into something irreversible. The words I had spoken were still hanging in the air when the room began to shift into a new kind of awareness, not confusion anymore, but structured understanding forming in real time. People who had spent their entire careers interpreting power dynamics were now silently recalibrating where they stood inside one that had just changed without warning. Olivia remained near the glass doors, no longer attempting to interrupt, but still unable to step away. I could see it in her posture that she was trying to regain control over the narrative in her mind, searching for any version of events where she still held interpretive authority over. What was happening? One of the senior board members stood again, this time with a different document in hand, and addressed the room in a tone that was quieter but more definitive. He explained that the activation of the Executive Transition Protocol also triggered immediate consolidation of decision-making authority across multiple subsidiary divisions, ensuring operational continuity without delay. His language was formal, but its meaning was not. It meant that influence had already shifted. It meant that decisions were no longer waiting for consensus. Olivia finally spoke again, but her voice had changed slightly, not in volume, but in rhythm, as if she was carefully choosing each word to avoid stepping on something she could not see. This was never part of our discussions, she said, directing her attention to the executives rather than to me this time. A man seated at the far end of the table responded without looking up from the document in front of him. He stated that the governance framework she was referring to had been embedded long before her tenure at the company and operated independently of day-to-day executive visibility. The phrase, independent of visibility, seemed to settle heavily in the room because it clarified something that did not need further explanation. Olivia's eyes returned to me again, and for the first time, there was something closer to uncertainty than disbelief. How long? She asked quietly. The question was not about timing in a literal sense. It was about everything she had assumed she understood about me. I took a moment before answering, not because I was unsure, but because I was aware that the answer would not resolve anything for her. Long enough that your version of me was never the full picture, I said. The words were not intended to wound, but they landed with a finality that no longer required reinforcement. The executive beside me adjusted a final set of papers and then closed the folder completely. He stated that operational authority would now transition across all affected divisions effective immediately, pending standard legal documentation updates. There was no celebration in his tone, no emphasis, only completion. Olivia stepped slightly forward, then stopped again, as if she had reached the edge of a structure she could no longer interpret from the inside. So what happens now? She asked, but the question sounded less like strategy and more like disorientation. I turned back toward the glass wall overlooking Manhattan. The city remained unchanged, its movement constant, its rhythm indifferent to what had just shifted above it. I placed one hand lightly on the edge of the table as I spoke without turning around. Now, I said, everything continues, just without assumptions. Behind me, I could hear the subtle movement of papers being organized, the soft closing of folders, the controlled adjustments of professionals returning to procedure after disruption had passed. Olivia did not speak again immediately. When I finally turned, she was still standing in the same place, but her expression had softened into something quieter, not acceptance, but recalibration. For the first time since the moment she had walked into that room, she was not trying to correct what she was seeing. She was trying to understand what she had missed. I picked up the folder in front of me, closed it fully, and placed it back on the table. No one stopped me. No one needed to. The structure had already acknowledged what it needed to acknowledge. As I walked toward the exit of the boardroom, the doors opened automatically, and I could feel the room behind me returning to order, not because anything had been undone, but because everything had already been decided. The moment I stepped out of the boardroom, the doors closed behind me with a soft, controlled precision that felt less like an ending and more like a transition being formally sealed. The hallway outside was quieter than before, as if the entire floor had adjusted its atmosphere in response to what had just been confirmed inside. I walked forward at a steady pace, not because I was in a hurry, but because there was no longer any reason to hesitate in a space that now recognized my presence differently. Behind the glass walls, I could see executives beginning to disperse, each returning to their responsibilities with a new awareness of structure that no longer required explanation. A man in a dark suit approached from the side corridor and slightly lowered his head in acknowledgement as I passed. "All departments have been notified of interim authority alignment," he said calmly, matching my pace for a few steps before falling behind again. The language was procedural, but its meaning extended far beyond procedure. It meant that the organization had already begun adjusting itself around the decision that had just been finalized. I continued walking until I reached the private elevator bank, where the doors opened before I pressed anything. As I stepped inside, I saw Olivia at the far end of the corridor, still standing near the boardroom entrance. She had not followed immediately, but now she moved, slower than before, her expression no longer locked in professional control, but in something closer to internal conflict. When the elevator doors closed, I could still see her reflection in the glass for a brief moment before she disappeared from view. The descent was smooth and silent, each floor passing like a measured confirmation of distance being redefined. When the doors opened again in the main lobby, the environment felt subtly different. People were still working, still moving, still engaged in their routines, but there was a shift in the way they oriented themselves when I passed. Conversations lowered slightly, heads turned briefly, then returned to their tasks with careful efficiency. I moved toward the exit, but before I reached it, I heard my name spoken from behind me. "Ethan." I stopped, but did not turn immediately. Olivia's voice carried through the lobby with a tone that no longer held authority, only recognition. I turned slowly. She was standing several feet away, no longer framed by executive control or boardroom structure, but by the open space of a public lobby where roles were less defined. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was not empty. It was occupied by everything that had been redefined in the past hour. She took a step forward, then stopped again, as if unsure whether the space between us still functioned the same way it used to. "I did not know," she said finally, but the sentence did not sound like an excuse. It sounded like an admission of incomplete understanding. I studied her for a moment, not with anger, but with clarity that had not been present in previous versions of our conversations. "You knew enough to decide who I was," I said calmly. The words were not raised, not sharpened, but they carried a finality that did not require reinforcement. Her gaze shifted slightly, not away from me, but downward, as if she was reviewing internal records that no longer aligned with current outcomes. Around us, the lobby continued its rhythm, but I could feel the subtle awareness of others in the space adjusting to the exchange taking place. Not listening, but recognizing. Olivia exhaled slowly, then nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "What happens to us now?" she asked, but the question was no longer about corporate structure or professional hierarchy. I took a moment before answering, allowing the weight of the question to settle into its true meaning. "We were already happening in different directions before any of this," I said. Today just made it visible. There was no immediate response. She stood still, absorbing the implication rather than resisting it. For the first time since everything began, there was no attempt to correct interpretation, no effort to regain control over narrative. Only understanding forming slowly, reluctantly. I turned slightly toward the exit doors again. Before I left, I paused and looked back once more. Olivia was still standing in the same place, but her expression had shifted into something quieter, not resolution, but recognition that certain structures do not collapse dramatically. They simply stop, including you. I walked out of the building into the city air, which felt unchanged, indifferent, and continuous. Manhattan stretched ahead as it always had, filled with motion, sound, and purpose. But behind me, inside the glass tower, a system had already adjusted itself around a new center, and for the first time in a long time, I was no longer outside of it. The city outside the glass doors had not changed, but the way I moved through it had. Every step I took away from Hayes Global Technologies felt less like leaving a building and more like exiting a version of life that had quietly ended without announcement. The sidewalk was crowded, yet everything around me felt strangely ordered, as if distance itself had become more deliberate. People passed by without noticing me, each absorbed in their own direction, unaware that above them an entire corporate structure had just reorganized itself around a decision that no longer required approval from anyone except those already inside it. I stopped at the corner near 6th Avenue, not because I was lost, but because I was aware that the pace of everything around me no longer matched the pace of my thoughts. My phone vibrated once. Then again, unknown numbers, messages attempting confirmation, notifications from systems I had not used in years now activating in sequence as if a dormant network had finally recognized its owner. I did not open any of them immediately. Instead, I looked up at the reflection of the building behind me in the glass of a passing taxi window. From the outside, it looked unchanged, identical to every photograph and memory of it. But I knew that inside, every assumption had already been rewritten. When I finally unlocked my phone, a single message stood at the top of the screen: executive alignment complete. Full authority confirmation registered. There was no celebration in the wording, no emotion, only completion. I placed the phone back into my pocket and continued walking. Somewhere behind me, Olivia was still in the building. I did not need to see her to know that she was no longer standing in the same mental position she had occupied hours earlier. The version of me she had defined had stopped existing in the way she understood it, and I knew that realization would not settle quickly. It never does when identity shifts without warning. The streets of Manhattan continued their rhythm, taxis honking, pedestrians crossing, conversations overlapping in layers of sound that did not acknowledge internal change. I reached the entrance of a quieter side street and paused beneath the shadow of a tall building where the noise of the avenue softened. Slightly. For the first time since entering Hayes Global Technologies that morning, I allowed myself to fully process the absence of resistance around me. There had been no argument, no confrontation strong enough to match the scale of what had occurred. Only recognition, documentation, and acceptance. My phone vibrated again. This time I answered. The voice on the other end belonged to the same executive who had spoken inside the boardroom earlier. He informed me that all transitional protocols were now fully integrated, that operational oversight had been redistributed, and that my presence would be required only for strategic briefings moving forward. His tone suggested nothing unusual had happened, as if this level of structural change was simply part of the system's design. When the call ended, I stood still for a moment longer, then began walking again. I did not return to the apartment immediately. Instead, I moved through the city at a slower pace, observing it not as someone trying to escape something, but as someone recalibrating their understanding of where they now stood within it. By the time I reached the river, the light had shifted slightly, reflecting across the water in long, uninterrupted lines. I stopped at the railing and looked out at the horizon of buildings stretching across the skyline. Somewhere in that structure of glass and steel, Olivia was likely still trying to reconstruct meaning from events that no longer operated under her previous assumptions. I did not feel anger toward her. That emotion no longer fit into the structure of what had taken place. What remained instead was clarity, the kind that does not arrive with noise but with absence of contradiction. My phone remained silent now. No further notifications. No interruptions. Just stillness. I exhaled slowly and placed both hands on the railing, letting the city continue without interruption around me. For the first time, there was no need to define where I belonged inside it. The system had already done that on its own. The riverfront was quieter than the rest of Manhattan, but even here the city never truly stopped moving. Boats crossed the water in slow, predictable lines, and the reflection of the skyline bent across the surface like a distorted memory of everything that had happened earlier in the day. I stood at the railing without moving, my hands resting lightly on the cold metal, not because I needed balance, but because I was finally in a moment where nothing required immediate response. My phone had remained silent for several minutes now, which felt unusual compared to the constant notifications earlier. It was not peace exactly, but something closer to completion, as if a long process had finally reached its final step without interruption. Behind me, footsteps approached slowly, measured, not urgent. I did not turn immediately. I already knew who it was. Olivia stopped a few feet away, not close enough to invade space, but close enough that the distance between us was intentional rather than accidental. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The wind coming off the river filled the silence, carrying the sound of distant traffic and city movement that continued as if nothing had changed. When I finally turned, she was standing there with a different expression than I had seen earlier. The control she always carried had not disappeared entirely, but it had softened into something more uncertain, less defined. "I tried calling you," she said, her voice quieter than before. I nodded once. "I know," I replied simply. She looked past me toward the water for a moment, then back at me, as if trying to find the correct framing for a conversation that no longer fit familiar categories. "Everything happened so fast," she said. The sentence was not a complaint, but an attempt at orientation. I understood that. I had been standing in that same kind of disorientation not long ago, before clarity replaced it. "It did not happen fast," I said calmly. "It only became visible fast." She did not respond immediately. Instead, she lowered her gaze slightly, as if processing that distinction. Around us, the city continued its rhythm without pause. People walking along the river path passed behind her without noticing the weight of the conversation taking place within a few feet of them. "What are you going to do now?" she asked after a moment, and this time the question carried less uncertainty about events and more about identity. I looked back at the skyline. The buildings stood in layers of glass and steel, reflecting light in ways that made everything appear both connected and separate at the same time. "Continue," I said. The word was simple, but it held more structure than explanation. She turned slightly toward me, studying my expression as if searching for something familiar that could still be accessed. "Is that it?" she asked. I paused before answering, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that whatever answer I gave would not return anything to the way it had been. "That is all it ever was," I said. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was final in a different way, not an ending created by conflict, but by recognition that two interpretations of the same life had reached their limit of overlap. Olivia exhaled slowly and looked back toward the river. "I did not see it," she said quietly. I did not correct her. There was no need. Some realizations do not require agreement, only acknowledgement that they arrived too late to change direction. A light breeze moved across the water, shifting reflections below us. I stepped slightly away from the railing, adjusting my position, not as a departure, but as a continuation of movement that no longer depended on where I had been before. Olivia remained where she was, watching the river, no longer speaking. After a moment, I turned fully and began walking along the path. I did not look back, not because there was nothing behind me worth seeing, but because everything behind me had already been accounted for in a structure that no longer required revisiting. The city stretched ahead, unchanged and indifferent, and for the first time, I did not need it to reflect anything back in order to understand where I stood within it.